Good afternoon and good evening to our European panelists and guests. On behalf of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Kansas, welcome to our panel, Trump Biden in the Eyes of Eastern European News Media. I'm Peter Bobkowski, Associate Professor in the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications, and I'd like to acknowledge the Journalism School and the Department of Political Science for co-sponsoring this webinar today. Perhaps the only silver lining of the COVID pandemic is that we are no longer hesitant to organize interesting discussions about niche topics with colleagues from across the continent and across the globe in virtual spaces, skipping the travel costs and other logistics that a year ago would have made a panel like this seem prohibitive. So I'm delighted to welcome this afternoon 5 journalism and media researchers who join us from 5 different institutions in the United States and Europe, and each of them bringing unique expertise on the media and political systems of 5 Central and Eastern European countries. By using an admittedly US-centric topic, our goal today is to understand the unique prisms through which each country's news media is framing the US election. This framing undoubtedly is shaped by post-Soviet political trajectories that each of these countries has been forging. In some of these countries, authoritarian regimes have been maintaining and consolidating control, although not without vocal oppositions. Others among these countries have been led for decades by democratically elected governments. The succession of these governments, however, have been uniquely flavored by each country's relationship to the European Union and other nationalist, religious, cultural and economic impulses and concerns. More immediately, the salience and framing of the US election is also shaped by each country's response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, with case counts in some of these countries increasing dramatically in recent weeks, and by other domestic issues like the recent abortion rights protests in Poland. So I hope that by using the US election as a focal point today, we will ultimately come to better understand each of these countries' media system, each country's key political characteristics and concerns, and how those shape that country's evolving relationship with the United States. I also hope that by looking at these 5 countries, we'll be able to draw some useful parallels and distinctions to help us understand this region's geopolitics more broadly. I have asked each panelist to speak for about 12 minutes, and audience members, you will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but please type your questions in the chat at any time. We will save those questions for after all 5 panelists have finished their presentations. And at that point, I will read your questions and our panelists will have an opportunity to address them and engage in further discussion. I will introduce each panelist before asking them to deliver their remarks, and we will proceed in the order in which the panelists are listed in our promotional materials. So first, we will turn to Dr. Anna Popkova. Dr. Popkova holds a PhD from the University of Minnesota and is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where she is also an affiliated faculty member of the university's Global and International Studies program. Her research on media, communication, and Russia-US relations has been published in the International Journal of Communication, the Hague Journal of Public Diplomacy, Place Branding and Public Diplomacy, International Journal of Strategic Communication, International Communication Gazette, the Journal of Communication Inquiry, among others. Dr. Popkova, welcome, and please start us off.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction and also for inviting me to be part of this panel. As I said at the beginning, when we were just informally chatting, the topic is certainly getting more and more um, heated and relevant day by day. So I am excited to share some of the things that I've observed, that I found in monitoring the ways in which Russian news media have been covering the U.S. election and the battle between Biden and Trump so far. Before I begin, I will point out that one of the things that is important to keep in mind when we're talking about Russian media and actually Russian political system as well is that while the Russian media space is certainly currently dominated by state-supported media, especially if we talk about television. And when we say dominated, when I say dominated, I also mean it in the sense of reach and the size of the audience and sort of how many people on a given day in Russia get their news from which channel. So in that sense, yes, objectively, Russian state-supported media dominate the space, the information space, but it is also very important to keep in mind that there are alternative players in the Russian news scene and political scene as well. So there are alternative media, we can call them oppositional media. They sometimes themselves refute that notion, saying that, well, we're just media and are doing journalism as opposed to propaganda. But for the sake of this discussion, I want to point out that what I did in preparing for this talk is I compared the coverage of the US presidential race as it is covered in the mainstream media, so state-supported media, and I looked particularly at television as opposed to oppositional media. And this is also an approach that is at the root of my research in general on Russian media and politics and Russia-US relations. So in that sense, it kind of also shows my overall scholarly approach to thinking about Russia, Russian media and Russian politics and Russia-US relations. So not just looking at Russia as this monolith. Um, so what I'm going to talk about is the general themes that I've identified while monitoring the coverage. And I will talk about some of the similarities and also some of the critical differences, because I think it's really on those intersections between the mainstream and alternative, the pro-Kremlin and oppositional coverage, where we're seeing these interesting nuances that tell us quite a bit about the Russian society as well, because each of those corresponding media have corresponding audiences as well. So the first theme that stood out to me definitely is that both oppositional and alternative or state-supported media discuss polls, and that's been going on since especially as the presidential race picked up speed, polls and how the two candidates are doing number-wise. So everyone is discussing polls, and all news media, especially recently, consistently point out that Biden is leading and Trump is losing in terms of numbers. But they also point out how polls in the American system are often not very reliable, and typically no one knows the final result. No one knows for sure what's going to happen until the actual election. So that has definitely been a predominant theme in the coverage by both pro-Kremlin and oppositional media. However, the interpretations of this theme are different, and these are some of the ways in which they're different. The oppositional media often admire the election process in the United States and just how it works, and just overall political life, how it is exciting, and they of course compare it to the current Russian political life that is pretty dull. And so they admire the process and the unpredictability of the process and how it's actually interesting to watch the race itself. And it's interesting to follow the candidates, and the process takes this interesting twists and turns. Now, the pro-Kremlin media generally take two approaches to this. One is where on the surface, they report objectively about it and about the unpredictability of polls. But when you hear when you hear the news stories and you hear the tone of voice in some of those newscasts, it almost seems like they're saying, well, look, there's America is so unstable. You cannot trust anyone, you cannot trust polls, there is chaos in the country. And it almost seems like they're implying that, well, but in Russia, things are stable and good, and you just always know the result. So there's a little bit of a, and perhaps it is also in the eyes of a behold of someone who's watching that. But in several of those news stories, it kind of jumped at me saying, so you're saying that things are crazy in America, but in Russia, everything is stable. You always know what the result of the election is going to be. So that's one way. And another way was that this narrative of unpredictability of polls is being connected to this element of the so-called silent voters. So several talk shows had experts on Russian state-supported television, had experts that explained how a bunch of voters in America tell pollsters one thing during the race and then actually come and vote differently. And so they were talking about them in the sense of voting for Trump, and how many people in America actually don't tell the pollster that they will vote for Trump or that they support Trump, but then they will support Trump. And what they do with that narrative, how they interpreted this on state-supported TV, is that these people are afraid to tell that or to admit that they're Trump supporters. And in turn, they're connecting it to this larger narrative that's been kind of a staple of the Russian TV coverage of America for a while already, of how there isn't really truly a freedom of speech and expression in America. If you do not agree with the majority, especially with the liberal majority, you're afraid to express your opinion. So that's that interpretation. The second theme that I found was just this comparison of the two candidates. And this is where the state-supported media, especially television, clearly portrayed Trump as a better candidate who is more competent and more charismatic and less old. And state-supported TV is just obsessed with Biden's age. They keep repeating it and they keep bringing it up in different contexts. And they don't mention that Trump isn't exactly 45 either, but somehow there's this just obsession with Biden's age. Oppositional media talk also about the candidate's age often, but they focus instead on the fact that both candidates are actually old. And when covering especially the debates that already took place, especially the first one, what I've noticed in the coverage by oppositional media, particularly TV Rain or Dozhd in Russian, it's the state oppositional TV channel, they frequently compared the debate to the situation of two grandpas arguing politics in the living room. So that was the difference there. One of the most striking differences that I've noticed, and that just jumped at me, is how differently Trump sounds when translated into Russian on state-supported TV versus oppositional. So on state TV, Trump actually sounds normal. They give him this, so there's the voiceover to translate his speeches at the rallies, and they give him this deep voice, and the sentences are coherent. The Russian speaking Trump actually doesn't sound very much like Trump. And so what I've noticed is that in TV Rain or Dozhd newscasts and stories, they selected the voiceover that is much closer in just tone of voice and timbre to actual Trump's voice. And they kept this Trump's kind of a word salad style of speaking in the Russian version as well. So I thought this was really, really interesting in terms of just, and it matched certainly the framing of both candidates by these two different types of media. Another way in which Russian state TV compared Trump and Biden was in terms of their closeness to the people. And that was, and still is, particularly prominent in the context of COVID and all the safety measures. So in several newscasts, state-supported media emphasized how Biden is being carefully protected, and I quote from one of those newscasts, he's carefully protected from the virus, from the crowds, and from uncomfortable questions. And then they follow it with, while Trump isn't afraid to go out and speak directly to the people. So again, they position Trump as more of a people's candidate and Biden as more of a Democratic establishment candidate, and they really emphasize that difference. So one last way in which Russian state TV depicts Biden as an inferior candidate is by connecting him to Obama. So that is where they tap into an existing narrative that they've worked for many years already on state TV, where Obama already has a negative image in the eyes of the state TV audiences. And so they are using this existing image to do two things. One is to say that, well, Biden will be and is just like Obama, and immediately it activates, well, and I didn't do the audience research for this, but that's the implication there, that would activate that connection to Obama. And the second thing that they're doing is they're pointing out that Biden is actually a weaker candidate than Obama because Biden keeps referencing in his speeches Obama and how he did this and that with Obama and how he succeeded in this and that with Obama. So he's constantly referring to Obama. And so the Russian state TV mentions that Obama himself, in fact, regarded Biden with irony. And in this case, they say irony to juxtapose it to admiration and respect. So they kind of belittle him a little bit by connecting him to Obama. The next theme that is and still is prevalent in the coverage is that both types of media speculate a lot about who, Trump or Biden, is better for Russia, of course. So this is where they domesticate, which is what all news media do in all countries. They tie them to local issues. And for Russia particularly, this is a relevant one, given all the Trump-Putin events and narratives. So here there is no consensus on either side. And there are arguments for both, ranging from Trump is in general better for Russia because him and Putin get along. And state TV actually jokes about it a lot in talk shows particularly. And oppositional media recently also made an argument, as recent as this week, about how Kremlin is actually really worried about Biden winning. And that's why, hence the unprecedented decision by Putin to agree to extend the New START treaty just as early as a few days ago, the arms control treaty, after the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs repeatedly declined to do that. So what they're saying in the framing of this decision by TV Rain, at least, they were saying that this is what Putin is trying to help Trump here to seal the deal before the election so that Trump can brag about this accomplishment in the foreign affairs domain. But another opinion is that Biden is actually more predictable and Putin knows him, and therefore it'll be easier for Putin to deal with Biden. So this theme also relates to conversations about Russia's interference in the US elections. And this is where state-supported media are somewhat schizophrenic about it. I chose that term because on the one hand, they deny that any interference had happened, and this has been the narrative that they've been peddling for a while, and they always refer to allegations of interference, especially in print media reports. So that's, I looked at some in addition to TV as well. But the narrative is that, the interference never took place, and the accusations are just a tactic in the political game. But on the other hand, hosts of TV talk shows joke about this constantly and joke about our Trump, or don't we determine who wins? So they kind of go back and forth and kind of play and flirt with this theme. And finally, and this is where this was something that I found particularly on the oppositional media side, especially TV Rain, I found that they demonstrate a much more nuanced understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement and the role of Black Lives Matter in this election, and actually engage in discussions and really interesting discussions about it and the coverage about the role of this movement in the elections. And the state TV doesn't really do that. So I'll stop at that and let the next speaker continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Popkova. Next, we will hear from Dr. Volha Kananovich. Dr. Kananovich holds doctoral degrees from the University of Iowa and from the National Academy of Sciences of Belarus. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, where she teaches journalism and multimedia storytelling. Prior to coming to academia, she worked as a journalist and a communication expert for international development organizations. Her research examines the role of political and media discourse in legitimizing and delegitimizing citizen engagement with the state across authoritarian and democratic contexts. Welcome, Dr. Kananovich.
Thank you so much. So thank you for having me, and I'm happy to be a part of this amazing panel. Let me share my screen with you because I have some slides that highlight some of the interesting portions of text, because I analyzed mostly newspaper discourse that reflect the key themes that I've been able to identify in Belarus news media coverage of Trump, Biden, and elections. But I'd like to start by laying out the key assumption that appears everyone who is on this panel shares, because that was the guiding premise of the panel, and that is that the coverage of Trump, Biden, and elections in general tells us a lot, and definitely more about the countries in the region than it does about the United States. And this leads me to the need to give you some understanding of what is going on in Belarus right now, because it's a very politically charged situation, also related to elections. So as some of you may know, in early August this year, Belarus held its own elections, and they were meant to legitimize the staying in power of Alexander Lukashenko, for whom it would be the sixth term. However, on the evening of the election, the protests erupted that questioned the results of the elections, that gave him an overwhelming over 18% support, supposedly, from the population. And this protest soon spread across the country. And so the questions of elections, of electoral process, that are really very highly relevant now in Belarus, and they also have high stakes. So I was approaching the analysis of the coverage of the electoral process in the US, and the way the political candidates, American political candidates, are framed in the Belarusian media through this kind of very localized perspective, and understanding that this is a situation that has a lot of stakes for the government. So it needs to have this kind of sensitivity. So let me give you some parameters of the media landscape in Belarus. So it is shaped by the majority of government-owned media, positioned against outlets that identify themselves as independent, which is quite understandable, given that that's probably the label media outlets would be more or less comfortable assigning to themselves when they operate in a regime that is considered to be a consolidated authoritarian regime. So I, similarly to Dr. Popkova, was looking at the coverage through this dual lens that recognizes what kind of side on the political spectrum this media outlet represents. And in order to get a sense of how state-owned news media operates and covers the elections, I looked at 5 newspapers. So I was mostly focused on state-owned press. So I analyzed the coverage of Biden and Trump in 5 newspapers that are part of the state-owned media group, Belarus Сегодня. It's led by the National Daily, with the largest circulation by the same name. It's owned by the presidential administration. And so essentially it operates as this key discursive space where the governmentally sanctioned positions are offered to citizens to consume and identify with. And so before I dive into the differences and some of the common themes that emerged from my observations, I want to say that I actually was very surprised by how salient both Trump and Biden were in the coverage of the government-owned press. And so I offer two interpretations for that. First, because there were so many things going on politically in Belarus, this vibrant grassroots protest that the government-owned press ignored, there was the need to fill in this hole for politically relevant coverage. And so essentially this reliance on international political events served to crowd out domestic coverage that was more problematic and more high stakes for the government press, and would put it in a more vulnerable position, a more problematic position where they would need to make choices how to approach domestic protests. And then it also, there was another interpretation that sort of emerged as I spent more time with the texts that were published in the government-owned press, is that it was really an opportunity for them, for the government actors, because the government does see the press as this continuation of the propaganda machine, as Lukashenko himself said. It was an opportunity for them to use the US elections as a highly salient event for ideological purposes. Before I offer you some of the observations about how exactly they serve to advance this kind of ideological political agenda of the government, let me just make one comment that illustrates the general approach of the Belarusian government press to covering international events. And that is reliance on third-hand, it's not even second-hand knowledge, it's a third or even fourth-hand knowledge. And to give you a sense how it may look like, so what you're looking at is a snapshot of an article that appeared on the website of Belarus Сегодня, of this media group. So it was written using the materials from the Belarusian wire service, which itself relied on the wire service on the Russian wire service, which itself relied on the Nielsen findings. So this kind of nested approach, where they don't do their actual own reporting, but they sort of construct and deconstruct these events, is reflective of both the problems that with the quality of the coverage, and also with how creatively they can, approach covering events when they are not constrained by doing their own reporting that would need to follow more strict and rigorous procedures for reporting and verifying. Another example, so this kind of matryoshka almost in this Russian tradition. Again, Belarus Сегодня, this time also a wire service. This time, again, the Russian wire service, and this time the United States Elections Project, which has been created by University of Florida professor. And something else that I hope those of you who are journalism professors would make cringe is the lack of basic fact-checking. So Sanders in this story appeared as Benry instead of Bernie. There are other more problematic claims that appear are also not verified. For example, here, this portion, this sentence talks about what Biden and Trump would do if they essentially fail to get support from the voters. And I want you to take a look at this sentence, which is so much going on. It's not a secret that Clinton, so Clinton is only referred by last name, instructed Biden in no circumstances to acknowledge Trump's victory or congratulate Trump if he wins. And then there is another claim, which is not, I'm not sure where it's coming from and how it actually made its own into the coverage, which says that in the worst case scenario, Biden already threatened Trump with a military coup at the White House. And coming back to this, it's not a secret sentence, it just illustrates this kind of very loose treatment of facts, of statements that are, again, not verified, are coming from translated resources and just packaged in stories and organized in a way that makes the narrative sort of stick and make sense. And also notice I mentioned that Clinton is referred to by last name, although this is the first time his name appears in this story. And it sort of shows this expectation that people would know who Clinton is. So to me, it signals, and it actually sort of supports my anecdotal observations that Clinton, Obama, now Trump, they have this very salient presence in both news media coverage and also in public discourse. So they always have are present there, very often embedded into conspiracy theory kind of narratives, but evoked as this strategic reference that the media falls back on when they need to make some kind of claim. So let's and as again, you see, I cannot get to the actual ideological purposes because it's all, all these problems with the reporting and with news writing itself just make me pause. Very often there is no contextualization for information that is offered here. For example, this one, this sentence, and this is a quote that wrapped up this story, talked about, and you may remember this. It quoted Trump when he denied the invitation to take part in the second debate that was supposed to be virtual because he said that he didn't want to be cut off, his mic to be cut off whenever the debate host would want. There is no context whatsoever where this mic issue is coming from, what's the broader, again, context that led to this quote. And it's sort of just left hanging in the air, which serves one purpose that I will touch on in just a second. And here's another one quote: "We can lock ourselves up in a basement like Joe does." So here Trump talks about how he again finds Biden not doing rallies, the kind of rallies that Trump does. Again, no contextualization, just this very fragmented, episodic, making no sense kind of comments that are put there in those stories and loosely connected to present the coverage of the events. And this is especially, this stands out because again, there is this very salient presence of both Trump and Biden, like almost day by day coverage where you track these candidates. And yet when you follow this coverage, it just somehow doesn't make sense. And so it leads me to this conclusion that channels what Dr. Popkova found in her research, in her analysis, is that the process presented as very chaotic, very disorganized. So here are just the headlines. The debate has finished, but the unpleasant aftermath remains. Biden and Trump nearly got into a fight with each other at the debate. The last Trump-Biden debate went without scandals, as if the scandals and this lack of politeness and lack of courtesy in political debate and in political discourse is the norm. Also, it's very often explicitly stated, especially not in news stories, but in opinion columns that are also saturate the coverage of the election in the Belarusian government owned press. For example, this statement that the electoral race in the US wouldn't be itself without accusations and harassment and loud statements. So again, this idea of this being very unauthentic process, very chaotic, very disorganized, not serving citizens well. And another story that sort of served to portray, to let the Belarusian readership meet Biden and learn about him, harped a lot on how he changed his ideas and treated this not as some kind of evidence of him evolving in his political stances, but to demonstrate that he is this establishment candidate who just conforms to whatever stance that would allow him to score political points. There was also a lot of presence of protests, which channeled Lukashenko's rhetoric a lot and legitimized the use of force. So I mentioned that all this coverage is happening while these protests continue to reel, the country and shake the country, the Belarus. And so here, some of the statements that Trump is quoted saying, they channel what Lukashenko says about protests. And by the way, there is no nuance in discussing the Black Lives Matter protests. They're very seldom, very rarely referred to as demonstrations or usually it's riots, unrest, protests. So radical movements are attempting to demolish our inheritance. This channels the idea that Lukashenko falls back on again and again, talking about how he preserved this post-Soviet legacy that people want to destroy. Then COVID-19 assigned the key role in inciting riots, something that is present in Lukashenko's rhetoric a lot. Trump says only force can stop riots in the US. And what is interesting is that this coverage of protests became more salient in September and in October, when I would say that they were not that, not necessarily that salient in the American public discourse. They increased their salience in the government-owned press. Why? Again, it's hard to talk about this in terms of why, but it needs to be pointed out that that's when the Belarusian protests were really on the rise, or at least not going away. And then the government-owned TV stations also talked about it. There was a 30-minute program with the member of the Belarusian parliament who talked about how tough Trump's decisions are justified in how he deals with protests, and he was usually referred to in terms of protests again. Peter, how am I doing on time? I want to make sure that I'm not going over.
Maybe just a couple of more minutes.
Okay, yeah, so early voting gets heavy coverage in the government-owned press, really heavy coverage, almost daily updates on how many people have voted. And the context that I think is important to have in mind is that early voting is not an argument, but is a topic that many Lukashenko's critics engage with, and many experts talk about when they talk about how manipulations and falsifications in Belarus are happening. So this idea of early voting as allowing the government to falsify the elections is what Lukashenko has to always combat. So, and in this sense, it's very interesting that early voting is again and again brought up in government press to sort of that I would argue serves to normalize this practice. For example, this article talks about how more than half, even although more than a half of Americans are not confident that the elections will be held honestly, which channels the kind of public discourse that is happening in Belarus. Belarusians don't trust the elections, but they say, look, Americans don't trust it either. At the same time, this opinion column said they absolutely mean Americans don't care about what other countries think. So to me, it sounds like an invitation to also sort of ignore what other countries think, and not to take it as a way to sort of delegitimize their opinions as a reason of concern. And then very quickly, what is like in the government meeting, government-owned press is Trump and Biden's positions on Belarus. So no actual localization is happening of presidential elections, no explicit one in government media and press. It is, though, in independent press, and usually Trump is brought up when he is relevant to Belarus, when he made some kind of statement, when he continues sanctions against Belarus, against something that is not there, like completely ignored in government-owned press, when he plans to nominate a new ambassador to Belarus, and when he makes statements about the situation in Belarus. And when he does something bizarre, he is present sort of this person who acts responsibly, not responsibly, but acts in a way that has consequences for Belarus. But also he has this kind of carnivalesque presence. He's the guy who declares himself to be second most popular person in the world after Jesus Christ. He's someone who makes this bizarre claims about coronavirus, that how mortality doesn't exceed 1%. He names his favorite dictator. He refers to Macron as prime minister. And so the independent press finds it enough to give space for Trump to be present on their pages in this kind of capacity. And finally, Biden is present there in the independent press as a source of legitimacy for Belarusian protests. For example, this story that talks about his statement where he called Lukashenko a dictator and condemned Trump for keeping silent. He is quoted with a variety of partial direct quotes, full quotes, like really, really long, robust quotes. Also, the independent press make an effort to explain how he's relevant, that he's not just another political candidate. He's a former vice president. He has a history of engaging against Russia on various topics, and he has this kind of institutional standing behind him, an institutional experience. And then there is another story that again goes into into a lot of detail about how he supports the protest and the Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who was named by the protesters as the person who won the election. And to conclude, the Trump-Biden portrayals in Belarusian press do reflect the political leanings of media outlets, but regardless of how they are presented, they do serve as these normative benchmarks that can give or deny the legitimacy to various Belarusian political actors and the Belarusian political process in general. So thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions after all the talks.
Thank you, Dr. Kananovich. And I do want to remind audience members, feel free to type your questions or comments in the chat, and we will address those once all 5 panelists have finished their remarks. So our next presenter is Mr. Tamás Tóth, who is a PhD candidate at Corvinus University of Budapest in Hungary. His research interests include populism in the United States and in Hungary. Recently, he has been constructing a methodological and theoretical refinement in this field, focusing on explicit and implicit populism in political discourse. He participates in research projects that focus on the role of the media in populism and also examines the center and periphery structures of globalized and internationalized science. Mr. Tóth's scholarly work has been published in leading communication and communication science journals. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. In general, I would like to briefly introduce you the political context and situation in Hungary because it's connected to the media situation too. Now we know that Viktor Orbán has been in charge since 2010. So we can say that he is a successful leader in terms of that he could maintain the power. Moreover, he could gain serious influence within the media. It means that he controls public media, every aspect of the public media. Some sources might say that the Fidesz, the ruling party of Hungary, controls the media. That's not true. That's not appropriate. The only and unambiguous leader, Viktor Orban, controls the media. His main ideology and approach to policies are emerging within the public media and in the considerable part of the commercial media too. So on the one hand, Hungarian taxpayers, let's say, found the public media, and it seems like it's supported by Hungarian taxpayers. This is not like this. To be honest, the stabilized situation of Viktor Orban is fixed, which means as follows. He controls the media, therefore he could construct images within the citizen's mind on problematic issues like immigration, like the opposition, like the fake news media, similarly to Donald Trump. In 2014, there was some kind of decrease within the popularity of Fidesz and Viktor Orban. And in 2015, there was a chance for him and for the ruling party to gain back popularity, and it was the migration crisis. And they started to push this type of agenda within the media, in the public media, in a large portion segment of the commercial media as well. In 2016, Viktor Orban claimed that he supports Donald Trump. Donald Trump in that time was only a candidate. Viktor Orban was the first leader who claimed publicly that he will support Donald Trump. Why is that? We know that Trump and Viktor Orban are on the right side ideologically. They are populist as well. Therefore, Viktor Orban can have a powerful ally in the US if Donald Trump wins the election. After this, we can understand how the Hungarian media work in that sense. On the other hand, there is an oppositional media too, a narrowing portion, but there is still oppositional media. First, I will speak about the media that is friendly to the government. Nowadays, in 2020, the coverage on the US elections is not as intensive as it was back in 2016. Somehow, the situation in the US is not that hysterical, let's say that. This is how the Hungarian media claim the situation in the American elections, like it was in 2016. To be honest, I think that the Hungarian media, which is friendly to the Hungarian government, has a very simple strategy. On the one hand, they do not criticize Donald Trump. I couldn't find any issue, any article that can be hostile to Donald Trump. On the other hand, they attack Joe Biden. They do not allege that Joe Biden's son might have had some kind of corrupt issues within Ukraine or in China. They don't allege that. They say it is a fact. This is a big difference. They say that in the debates, Donald Trump in the first debate was very charismatic. He could control the debate. He was the leader of the conversation. On the second debate, both the oppositional media and the other side also claim that it was a little bit calmer. It was a gentleman's game, let's say that. So, in this sense, we can say that Viktor Orban supports Donald Trump via the media, but in a calm way. So, nowadays, I just started to analyze the Hungarian media context. and that part that is friendly to the government. And ideologically, now it is not connected to Donald Trump as intensively as it was connected in 2016, because the political agenda in the United States changed a little bit. The xenophobic rhetoric, the exclusionary way of style of Donald Trump was very similar to Viktor Orban's and Fidesz basic communication strategy. Therefore, the Hungarian media, a considerable part of Hungarian media, also pushed that kind of political agenda. In this sense, we can understand why this type of logic started to change. So nowadays, the political agenda doesn't focus on the xenophobic attitude as severely as in 2016. Nowadays, Donald Trump himself tends to speak about the left, the far left. This is not an appropriate issue in Hungary nowadays. It could have been 20 years ago or maybe 30 years ago after the fall of the communist regime, but nowadays it's not the most appropriate enemy, let's say. So if we take a look at on the oppositional media love to play with the statistics. They try to predict the final outcome of the election. We can say that the oppositional media try to characterize a very interesting situation which can destroy Viktor Orban's ally in the US. In 2014 and before that, we didn't really have a good relationship. I mean, we, the political elite, didn't really have a good relationship with the American political elite. After 2018, we started to have a better relationship. Trump just called Viktor Orban via phone. He invited him to the media and to the White House as well. So they had a meeting, which was a dream of Viktor Orban. Of course, it had a large publicity within the Hungarian media, in the oppositional media, and in the other side as well. So nowadays, the oppositional media try to find out what will happen if Joe Biden wins. What will happen to this kind of partnership between the United States and Hungary? And the oppositional media suggest that there will be a major problem to Viktor Orban. Joe Biden just claimed that we should take a look around in the world and see how kind of these totalitarian regimes like Hungary started to emerge within Central Europe. So this kind of issue was depicted in the Hungarian media as well. So in that sense, the opposition and media try to find out what will happen if Donald Trump loses the election. Yes, so this is the main idea. To be honest, the ideological part, as I mentioned before, is not as important nowadays in the Hungarian media. The oppositional media enhanced that in the debates, Joe Biden did better as he does in general at debates. He was relatively logical, he was relatively fluent, sometimes he stubbed, but he had, let's say, counterattacks against Donald Trump in the first debate. So there was a blame game, but it wasn't one-sided. So it was back and forth, which can show that Joe tried to push back Donald Trump. He wasn't that successful, but he wasn't bad either in terms of debating civilly with Donald Trump. I just checked quickly within Google Trends the basic statistics on Biden, Trump, and the US elections. In 2016, there was a slightly more interested, I would say it was slightly more hits on the name of Trump and the US elections. So nowadays, people's interest started to decrease on the issue of the US elections. I think in 2016, the debates and the political agenda within the United States were a little bit of, let's say, adversary and hostile, much more hostile than nowadays. And it could be spread via the press much more easily. So it was a little bit of fun to read and listen to that kind of debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Nowadays, the situation and the debates weren't as chaotic and weren't as aggressive as it was back in 2016. So, in general, I would say that the media related to support the government and Viktor Orban still backs Donald Trump in a silent way, but they attack, on the other hand, Joe Biden. The oppositional media doesn't really attack or criticize Joe Biden. It claims that Joe Biden is a typical part of the elite, the political elite, which can be a weapon in Donald Trump's hands. As a populist, he can enhance that, oh, sleepy-eyed Joe started his career 47 years ago, and he has done nothing for American people. The typical populist rhetoric and style he just keeps using. What is common in the Hungarian media, in the opposition side, and let's say on the other side? One thing is common, and they claim that both candidates will focus on the issue of China after the victory, because China is a political competitor. He can be a threat to the United States in an economic way. And either way, Donald Trump or Joe Biden will try to find some kind of solution to this challenge. So this would be my basic idea on the coverage on the US elections in 2020. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter also joins us from Europe. Dr. Eva Nowak-Teter is an associate professor in the Faculty of Political Science and Journalism at Maria Curie-Sklodowska University in Lublin in Poland. She is the editor-in-chief of the journal Mediatization Studies. Her research focuses on mediatization, political communication, and public opinion. She has published a monograph on media policy agenda setting and several articles in academic journals and edited books devoted, among others, to political communication, mediatization, and agenda setting. Her academic experience includes visiting positions at the Grenoble Institute of Political Studies and at the Dresden University of Technology. Welcome, Dr. Nowak-Teter.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I am very happy to be in Texas. It's a pity I have to be only virtually. I hope that will be the chance to be in real. I will try to put my presentation on the screen. I have a quite different presentation because I prefer to have some structure. So the agenda of my presentation will be to present firstly public opinion, Polish public opinion about Donald Trump popularity of among public opinion in Poland about Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Then I will present the most popular topics reported in Polish media, and also the most significant messages of Polish press, Polish TV about the Trump-Biden campaign and the Polish issue. And I will also present how Polish news media are divided in terms of presenting and supporting candidates. That is the political bias when presenting the campaign. And I will also present some and give you some cases and examples and citations from the news media. So what is the Trump-Biden popularity in public opinion polls? Firstly, so the state-owned research agency survey, a very fresh survey, revealed that over 40% of polls is the opinion that Donald Trump would be a better president of the USA. But among these respondents, 70% is of right-wing views. What is also important in this survey is that 33% is interested in the presidential election in the USA. 74% consider this election is important for Poland. And as we can see, only 15% support, more or less support Joe Biden. So Donald Trump is quite more popular, much more popular than Joe Biden at present. When we look at the Polish page of Google Trends, we can see that these results not necessarily support what the state-owned research agency showed. We can see that probably people in Poland, at least internet users, are not so much interested in presidential campaign in the USA. So the highest interest we could observe at the beginning of October, when Donald Trump was infected by coronavirus, and during the first presidential debate, but generally the interest is not so high. What are the most important, the most popular topics of the news media messages? Generally, we have many reports about the negative campaign, also about the humor of the campaign. Also, the presidential and vice presidential debates were widely reported. Donald Trump's COVID illness and its consequences were also discussed, but the majority of messages is focused on international relations in Polish context. So the main question journalists in Poland are asking is which of the two, that is Trump and Biden, will be tougher against Russia. So the Russia and the USA relationship in the Polish context is probably the most important question when reporting this campaign. And I will also devote some place to this Polish issue in the international context. What was especially noticed both by the liberal media and the right-wing state-owned media was the so-called Polish faux pas of Joe Biden, but it was also the Belarusian faux pas. I don't know if it is faux pas, but for Poland, it probably is. Poland, Hungary, and Belarus were enumerated as totalitarian regimes, at least rising totalitarian regimes. Also, in Polish context, the so-called LGBT-free zones were criticized by right-wing press, right-wing news media, but also the speech of Joe Biden about a Polish-American club, and that they stopped showing up in these clubs. So, of course, he would to say that Polish people are not smart people, but the right-wing news media were reporting this issue as insult, and the liberal media only just noticed this faux pas as just faux pas of Joe Biden. What were the other reports, the topics of the reports about Trump and Biden? Is that Trump is the best president for Poland, so conservative media are praising, are supporting Trump quite visibly. It is thanks to military cooperation and the visa requirements for Poles. And Trump will be a better president for Polish government, say the liberal media, and Biden will be more demanding probably in case of in terms of human rights and rule of law in Poland. And they believe, the liberal media believe, that Biden will not abandon Poland against Russia in particular, but both sides, that is liberal and conservative media, are discussing about who will support Polonia in the USA, but nobody knows who will they support. I think at present it is similar situation. So why I am so focused on the conservative and liberal left-wing media? Because it is quite visible. The political bias is quite visible, and the message is really different when we look at the conservative media and when we look at the liberal media. For example, the conservative media say that President Trump is in a good shape after the COVID illness, and his speeches are phenomenal, and the victory of Biden would be a threat to Poland. He is a pawn to European left, and he is going to abandon us in the Russian zone of influence. Joe Biden is just earning money in Russia and Ukraine, and that Joe Biden is impatient. It is a context of looking at the clock during the debate. And Biden's presidency means that the global position of the USA would be worse. I have no idea why this message is like that. But it is probably connected with the future isolation, the expectation of isolation of Joe Biden's future policy, and they suspect that that Biden will support leftist and nihilistic revolution that would win in the USA. They assessed the last Trump-Biden debate as a draw, and generally they noticed that Ukrainian money was a topic of the debate versus Trump taxes problem. Liberal and centrist media, on the other hand, were quite engaged in reporting the debate. For example, the wife of the former Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ann Applebaum, belonged to the most harsh critics of Trump. So, for example, his messages include critics of Trump, like Trump first, and that he is unprofessional and incompetent, and his ties to Russia remain unrevealed, and the other news media present first Trump-Biden debate like Biden was perceived as a good man, and the chances of Trump to win are decreasing. Trump has broken the debate rules and lied about COVID-19, his taxes and economic boom during his presidency. Also, the topic of taxes was revealed in the news media. They are discussing if Texas will change the color, and they are expecting that Trump will not win. Barack Obama's speech was also reported supporting Joe Biden, and that Trump does not will protect American people. And the conclusion is that generally Donald Trump weakens and that he is defeated by COVID-19, and his last hope is Florida. What was also popular in Polish news media, apart from the so-called Polish issue, was the negative campaign and humor. For example, this picture of Biden for president was widely presented and discussed. Also, the illness of Trump was the topic of at least, I think, a few days of the campaign message, and Trump is accused of regarding senior people as unwanted, and also the male voting as presented as suspected, not so fair, or maybe even fraud. On the other hand, also the infotainment and entertainment of the campaign is quite popular in Polish news media. For example, the debate of Pence and Mike Pence and Kamala Harris was mainly reported as in this campaign, a fly stole the show. And the first Trump-Biden debate was seen through the lens of the statement "Shut up, man." And Sleepy Biden also was also presented as a humor of the campaign, and the statement of the Trump, as I know that Biden, it is a miracle that he is still alive. This is the main content of my presentation, and I think that I hope I will have the chance to answer the question about these topics of the campaign, the Polish issues, and the generally the content of the Polish reporting about the campaign. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Our final presenter is Dr. Ivanka Pjesivac, who holds a PhD from the University of Tennessee and is an associate professor in the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia in the United States. I have to say this in this context. Dr. Pjesivac has researched the cultural context of journalism processes and the relationship between political regimes and media systems. She also has studies the effect of design and cognitive variables in information graphics and the emotional and cognitive effects of immersive journalism. Her research has been published in Journalism, Theory, Practice, and Criticism, Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, Mass Communication and Society, Journalism Studies, among other venues. Welcome, Dr. Pjesivac.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for having me today. So I'll talk about the media context in Serbia and the American elections. And American elections have been followed closely around the world, so it's not a surprise that they are being closely followed in Serbia as well. For context purposes, I'll just briefly mention that Serbia is ruled by President Aleksandar Vučić and his Serbian Progressive Party. And during his presidency, Serbia has been developing relationships with the United States, European Union, but at the same time with Russia and China. Several international media monitoring agencies are noting the drop in democratization scores for Serbia, with media freedoms being one of the major concerns. These agencies are noting that the scores for the free speech and professional journalism have been dropping. And they have especially noted problems with media censorship, pressures on journalists, physical attacks on journalists, and public officials using their pressure on journalists and playing favorites with the media. So Freedom House now labels Serbia as partly free, and while the Democracy Index classified it as electoral autocracy for this year. For context purposes, it is also important to understand relationships between America and Serbia, diplomatic relationships between America and Serbia. Not, of course, all of them, but just some more recent ones that I think burden the perceptions of American politics within Serbian public opinion. And that certainly is the developments from the 1990s. And during the breakaway of the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the United States engaged in military and economic conflict with Serbia, which at the time was under the regime of Slobodan Milošević. And during the 1990s, conflicts in the Balkans, the United States imposed sanctions on Serbia, which is then part of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, together with Montenegro, and engaged in NATO bombing against Yugoslavia in 1999. So that left a significant mark on the population in Serbia and their perceptions of American foreign politics, especially the Democratic Party, which was then under President Clinton. Later in the 2000s, diplomatic relations have been restored, right, and somewhat normalized. But to this date, I think that these events from the 1990s burden the perception of American politics among Serbian publics. And I think that's important to mention and to understand that almost any candidate coming from Democratic Party, especially Joe Biden, who was at the time also active, will carry certain perceptions among Serbian population, negative perceptions among Serbian population. So for this panel, Peter asked me to talk generally about how media in Serbia cover American elections. And I reviewed websites of some major Serbian media organizations in order to do that. For comparative purposes, I tried to look at the websites and web portals. Although some of these websites are of major TV stations, let's say, but I looked at their web presentations, right? I did not cover weeklies because their web presence is often under the paywall, just to mention that. And I try to focus on the period from the first debate until today to make this more manageable and comparable. So it's also important to mention that these results, and these are just my impressions, so they're not the results of systematic analysis, where we would count and analyze quantitatively. They're the results of me reading news media and giving you some major themes that I noticed. So the results are not generalizable. There are, of course, many directions that we can go into, but I will here present some major themes that appear across Serbian news media outlets, and I will not classify them by type of media or political leaning, but I'm happy to talk about it later if you have time. I know we don't have a lot of time. So the first major theme that I noticed, no, first of all, I have to say that there is a substantial coverage of news stories about American elections in Serbian media. They cover it every day, and sometimes there are several stories per day. These stories appear under the world event section, but sometimes because of the importance of the event, they also appear on the first pages or the main pages, right? The outlets which have television stations also dedicate videos and video stories, as well as talk shows where they discuss about American elections and the implications. So apart from the stories that focus solely on American elections, there are also a lot of stories from America that treat other topics, such as COVID-19, weather-related stories, protests, race issues, police brutality, bilateral relations between the United States and other countries, such as Russia, Iran, Turkey, and China, nomination for Supreme Court justices, then developments around Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, and many other daily events. So in general, we can say that Serbian audiences are given information about American elections, but as well as information about other developments in the United States, provided that they read it, of course. So now let's focus on the stories about the elections. They are mainly, in terms of the format, they are mainly because it's on the website, they're text plus pictures. But as I said, and then the TV stations, when the portal is also a TV station, they also have a video and special talk shows. The main topics and the main themes that I noticed across outlets, the first is, of course, debate team. I covered that period, so that one emerged as the first one. That's the dominant one. Serbian media in Serbia covered the debates. But the first one was characterized as one that has been filled with, and I quote, insults, strong attacks. So there was this focus on how impolite the debate was and how rude. And there is one political analyst that was a guest at a public TV station that said it was one of the most scandalous debates ever. And it was painful to watch. How candidates for the most important position in the world behaved. So in later coverage, this offensiveness and disrespect that was shown in American debate was juxtaposed to the election debate in New Zealand, where two women candidates, and I quote, were civilized, smiling, giving each other compliments. And the media in Serbia said that was unlike the one in the United States, and that Trump and Biden could learn more from these two ladies. Media in Serbia also covered immediate reactions to the debate and reported about the polls that have been predicting who's going to win which debate and who won which debate. The stress was also then later on the format change, right? After the first debate, whether it's going to be virtual or not. Are there going to be some restrictions, having in mind the language used in the first debate? And of course, having in mind Donald Trump testing positive for COVID-19. So there was a lot of talk about the format and the language used in the debate. There were also tries to be more, there were also in some stories, Serbian media tried to be more analytical and to talk about the actual topics of the debate and what are the actual topics that would determine these elections. So they mentioned, would COVID-19 be the topic that would prevail and determine the winner of this election, or it would be economy or some other issues. The second major theme is something that I call the Trump theme. Of course, due to the personality of President Trump, it is not rare that media in the world focus on his personality and the language, and it has been the case during 2016 elections, I would say, and it is happening again. So in this respect, important part of the coverage in the media in Serbia was the language and controversial actions that Donald Trump did or said. So in that regards, they reported that Trump depicted Kamala Harris as a monster, Nancy Pelosi as crazy Nancy, that he said that Biden had dementia, and that that Donald Trump called Fauci an idiot. And it was also reported that his, as I say, controversial actions, such as that he's not wearing a mask, and when he was getting out of the hospital, just after several days, that he was saying that he was more popular than Jesus, his tweets being taken down, that during his campaign rallies, he said he's going to kiss and hug everybody. So there was a lot of that appearing in the media. The third team is something that I called what if team. So there were articles focusing on what will happen, for example, if Trump gets sicker during this particular election, right? Also, would then, like, what would happen, right? In that regards, it was mentioned that there were Republicans who were ceasing to give him support. Then it was there were articles that dealt what if Biden wins, what if Trump wins, and so on. So there is this what if team. A part of that team is also a sub-team of elections predictions, and some of the colleagues mentioned in their respective countries and the countries that they cover. Also in Serbia, media in Serbia are reporting about the polls and election predictions. So at the beginning, I was seeing some headlines that were really not decisive that much, that there was not a clear lead who's going to win. But lately, I'm seeing some headlines where they're saying that Biden is in the lead, which might change in 2 days. I don't know, but this is what I'm seeing. It, of course, depends on the media outlet and who is reporting. But again, as I said, if we have time, we can mention that later. There's a fifth team, and that's the voting process itself. So media in Serbia are reporting about early voting. They're showing pictures of long lines and discussing what could that mean. They're also speculating how Serbian diaspora in the United States might vote. As you know, there is a sizable Serbian diaspora in the United States. So there are some reports and news articles dealing with how Serbian diaspora might vote. So just yesterday, I saw the news article about Ambassador Granol visiting Serbian club in Milwaukee and calling them to show support for President Trump. So in that regard, so that it was also mentioned that there is a part of Serbian diaspora that calls themselves Serbs for Trump. So there is a coverage of that as well. Also, in that context, some of the media reminded what Biden was saying about Serbians during 1990s, which was not very flattering. The sixth major theme is, of course, how does this affect Serbia? What happens if Biden wins? What happens if Trump wins? Who would be a better president? Of course, this is inevitable. Who would be better president for Serbia and why? So in that context, that there are some stories that, interview people, political analysts, and trying to analyze who would be better president for Serbia, right? And finally, there were stories that didn't fit into these themes, but that they call interesting stories about elections, such as Greta Thunberg called Americans to vote for Biden, Europeans worried whether the elections in the United States are going to be fair or not, how will Hollywood win, how will Hollywood vote, sorry, or some stories about Kanye West and his, so there are these random stories about also elections in America that don't fit into these larger themes. So this is, there's also very interesting use of sources. Somebody mentioned this nested, I think Volga, the nested approach to reporting. And there is also a lot of these stories are actually taken from foreign sources, right? Because not a lot of media have their foreign correspondents in the United States, right? There are some media that have foreign correspondents that they would use their reports, but there is also a lot of reliance on, let's say, reports from Reuters or reports from CNN, and like foreign news agencies, Western news agencies, just because there is none from, there is not a lot of foreign correspondence in Serbia. So there's also differences between media outlets in terms of their reporting. And this theme of how does this affect Serbia might be dominant in terms of how Serbia perceives future American foreign politics. But again, I would be happy to amplify on any of that in the questions. I know we don't have a lot of time, Peter, so.
It's wonderful, thank you. So again, audience members, feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat. And we have a couple that came in earlier. One was, I think, for Volga. Seems like disparate elements. You were talking about how the Belarusian media had sort of all different and not very well connected ideas about the election. So the comment was, seems like disparate elements meant to provoke emotional responses about the election.
I would say that this resonates with how I read them and interpreted them. So I would say that I would say it's a post-Soviet tradition and legacy of journalism there. Journalists are okay with very emotionally charged language. So I feel that there is this kind of constraint in trying to be factually based and not to introduce your own interpretation. And very often this interpretation is very emotional. So there are not a lot of, there's not a lot of support or buying in this for the idea that it's not okay to sort of, you should have this mental check for you whenever you wanted to editorialize. And I would say that, especially in government-owned newspapers, that they have this kind of long history of being propaganda tools rather than doing actual journalism. You would definitely see a lot of that. Yeah. Thank you for this comment.
And then the other thought was for Professor Nowak-Teter. If Polish state media tend to favor Trump, why did they determine that the last debate was a draw?
I think that the message is sometimes, the message of state-owned pro-governmental media is sometimes differentiated, and apparently they considered the result of the debate as balanced, so they did not need to lie so much about the debate, and this is the reason. I don't know each of the reason how the message, how the picture of the debate is reported. So sometimes it is not just one-to-one that every message is pro-Trump and or anti-Biden. It is possible that, especially in terms of international global issues, sometimes also these pro-governmental are more balanced than it will be in case of Polish issues. So this is my answer for this question. I'm not sure if it is this case. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have a really a good question. So most of you talked about newspapers, online news sites, television broadcasts. But the question is about social media. So have you noticed any discussions happening around US elections on social media, for example, on Twitter or other social media? What kinds of tones or perceptions might be dominant in those? If it's at all, if you're able at all to sort of qualify that.
No, to be sincere, I didn't observe the social media about the campaign. I was more interested in Google and Google searches. This is my field of interest, but of course I can do it, but I'm not able to do anything responsibly about the social media at present.
Others of you?
I can only offer some anecdotal observations, and that they are very much informed by my media habits. But I would say that social media users, those people who are on Facebook, on Telegram, that's a social media platform that is used a lot, that are within my circles, because that's what I rely on by the nature of this media outlets. They are very, very focused on what's going on in Belarus now in terms of political issues, because there's so much going on with protests and with with demonstrations. People are really focused on themselves, and that's why it is so interesting that in that international media, this is what reflected this interest on Belarus. So Biden could only make its way when he provided support to Belarus. Trump only could make its way into the coverage when he really said something about Belarus, or was bizarre enough, or did something that was bizarre enough that scored high on novelty, if we talk about news values, that was deemed newsworthy enough. And when he, let's say, said that he's second popular after Jesus, or some other examples that I gave. But yeah, mostly it's so about us. What do we do? How do we power through? Yeah, so this is my anecdotal observation.
And others of you, social media, any observations?
I will also say that I haven't done specifically an analysis of social media, of what's going on in social media in the Russian networks about the election, but based on my, again, just like Dr. Kananovich just mentioned, based on just my observations on the basis of using social media every day, I'm seeing very similar themes that I've mentioned in my presentation that I've observed on TV, just kind of different variations of those themes, and also divided across those ideological lines. I do purposely follow some accounts that I ideologically disagree with, but as a researcher, I have to know. So that's there's a match there for sure in terms of just narratives.
There was a comment or question: how can the two sides' interpretations, state supported versus opposition, be compared to the two sides' interpretations seen in U.S. media? Dr. Popkova or anyone else who might want to comment on that?
Yeah, one of the things I haven't mentioned, but that was definitely a part of the analysis, or something that came up there, was that the state-supported TV, for example, they have so many clips from Fox News embedded in their coverage of Trump, especially the ones where they glorify Trump and talk about how great he is and how competent he is. So in that sense, I would say that the oppositional or independent media, they kind of do a little bit of both, and they actually explain that, well, here's Fox News, and here's their reputation in the United States, and here's CNN, and here's what they do. So in that sense, there was that conversation, I guess, and interplay in terms of the actual direct comparison, ooh, that's we could have a whole panel just on that. And in terms of just similarities and differences in ideological lines and the corresponding narratives, and it'd be hard to not slip into whataboutism there too. But yeah, that's I think. I'm actually, it takes me back to my dissertation. That was all just, there was a 4x4 comparison, US mainstream alternative, Russia mainstream alternative. And that's where I did a lot of that as well. So there's certainly something there.
One idea I was wondering about, and Dr. Wood actually brought this up as well, is that a lot of what you were talking about in the type of coverage that's done is very personality focused, it seems like, with maybe some election issues, but not many sort of substantial issues being discussed and the candidates' positions on those issues. So the question is about global climate change. Have you seen stories in your country's media coverage about the candidates' policy regarding the environment?
I haven't seen any, I would say. And I think that this reflects just the lack of resources to do this kind of substantive coverage. It's much easier resource-wise to just grab whatever it is there that people would be able to relate to. And this is often this kind of personality-based kind of coverage or horse race coverage, which does not take a lot of resources for journalists to spend time and to really dig in and make sense of it, and then explain it to let's say Belarusian readers that may not have this kind of understanding or not maybe lacking context. So I would say no, and that's probably this kind of reflection of the challenges that the media in my country at least has covering foreign countries in foreign context.
As I could observe, in one of the newspapers mentioned that Joe Biden attempts to join the Paris Agreement. So this was a kind of reference on that issue. But in general, in Hungary, regarding topics, journalists were focusing on the topics that can be a damage for each of the politicians. So let's say they try to emphasize that kind of political agenda that might cause severe damage on the reputation of the politicians and candidates. So that was my basic observation.
Others about the environment or other issues that, you know, candidates' positions are discussed?
Yeah, I also, I second the Paris Agreement argument because that was, or issue, I suppose, that was the context in which the environment came up in what I've seen. So that I wouldn't say it was as prominent as other topics, but it came up. But it was just in the context of the Paris Agreement, and it was mentioned that Russia is also part of it in the state-supported media.
I cannot rule out that they exist, but completely, but because, you know, it's just cannot recall right now. But there have been some analysis in terms of like major issues that could damage candidates, right? Or that could be important for these elections. Corona, economy, race issues in the United States, protests. So those were some of the issues that have been mentioned. But as I was covering the periods, is the first debate. I mean, I of course read before that, but for this particular panel, I focused on this time period. And then in this time period, really the debates were really dominant and early voting. And then the personality theme also emerged. And of course, the relations with Serbia, because also lately, the Serbian president signed with an agreement in DC, which was brokered by Trump between Serbia and Kosovo, right? So there is that issue as well there, and it wasn't directly, I didn't mention it because it wasn't directly related to elections, right? But it's part of the context in which one of the candidates might be seen among Serbian population. And then later during his campaigns, President Trump also mentioned that he brokered the agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, right? So obviously for him, that was important as a foreign policy achievement. For Serbia, it was an indication where would US foreign policy go if Trump is reelected, right? And then that was juxtaposed to Biden and the Democratic Party foreign policy. Where would that go? Because again, as I mentioned, as I said, there is this the events from 1990s, and there is in the minds of Serbian people that who is elected as American president can have direct consequences on them, direct. So it's not something that, yes, it's something that's going on in the United States, but they're very well aware that it can have direct consequences on them, right? So.
In my country, the climate change is not so popular topic at all in any type of press or news media. So the climate change in the context of American campaign was noticed. I don't remember exactly, maybe by one of the liberal media, but it was not the issue of the campaign. It was not one of the main topic. So the ideological or the religion topic would be probably the more popular and more reported than climate change or environmental issues. Mm-hmm.
One small comment. Another important topic within the Hungarian media was the behavior of Trump and Biden regarding the mask and traveling around the US. So Trump tends to travel and campaign in public, and it can be some kind of backlash because he doesn't behave as a responsible leader, but Joe Biden doesn't show up in public and he stays at home, and this can be a good example, and this can make people a little bit more conscious on the COVID. And this was another topic that emerged again and again in the Hungarian newspapers, the difference between the public campaigning, traveling, meeting with fans, supporters, and the importance of the responsibility. The different type of behaviors can provide different types of responsibilities. So on the one hand, Trump wanted to show that he wants to be close to people as far as he can. Biden tried to demonstrate that he doesn't want to go close to people, meet them in public, because he's responsible for Americans' lives. And the number one issue in this situation is the health and the COVID. And this was an important aspect in the Hungarian press, even in the printed one and in the online press and in the TV channels too.
So one other question, and I was really fascinated by this as well. I think Dr. Popkova brought this up about the dubbing or translating Trump. And so Professor Wood again asks to make Trump sound more lucid or coherent while opposition media translate Trump more directly. Does this happen in other countries, especially Hungary or Poland?
Could you explain more in details this question. I'm not sure if I understood you properly.
So the Russian example was that in the state-owned media, and correct me if I'm wrong, right, Dr. Popkova, in state-owned media, Trump, the dubbing and the translation of Trump made him sound more like he was speaking in complete sentences. And I think the voice also sounded like it was a more authoritative voice. Does that happen in other countries, in other contexts?
No, I don't think that it was this way, just manipulating with the voice or the picture of the candidates, but it goes like naturally because of the nonverbal communication of Trump and Biden, because Trump is much more expressive than Biden, who is very calm. So I think that the speeches, the statements of Trump could be easier to be perceived, to be interpreted, to be discussed, could be more interesting. But at the same, I think it was that the speeches of Trump were reported by liberal press as a bit stupid, the reason to discuss some jokes about Trump, so it goes like naturally. But the manipulation, I didn't notice any manipulation about the picture and the voice in my country.
In Hungary, they tend to translate the debates, and I watched the 2016 debates in Hungarian too, and it doesn't look like a debate rather than a documentary. So it's not that, how could I say, it's not that emotional in Hungary. It could be, but the tone of voice of the commentator was like consistent. You couldn't feel the tension between the two candidates. I haven't checked the new version, so the Hungarian version of the American debates, but I think I will in the next couple of days. I think it will be almost the same. I'm not sure, but I think it will look like a documentary. So it's way more bigger fun to listen to this kind of debates in the original language, I think, because the commentators or the narrators doesn't have such a good tone of voice in the political debates. You cannot understand and feel the tension between the candidates and nominees in that sense, I think.
Yeah, I didn't notice the manipulation, but I have to say that there is a certain training for people who work in public broadcasters in how they talk and address the audiences. So the tone and the dynamic of their reading of news is a little bit different than, let's say, in private TVs, where they have been given, journalists have been given more freedom to read to read their scripts, right? So, but there is definitely when you are watching Serbian, let's say, public television, there is overall a little bit different dynamic of reading, but that's because of the training of journalists. It's not because let's make Trump sound more right, calm, right? I think it was the training. Again, which I'm not sure what's going on in Russia and whether that's the case in Russia. I'm just saying that, yeah, when you are looking as an outsider, you might think, oh, these people cannot really interpret Trump, which I don't know who can, in terms of when there is a translation, how can that be really as Tamás said, it's much better to listen to the debates in English, right? If you want to get the gist of and the dynamic of these conversations. So it's hard to translate it and it's hard to dub it if you're not an actor, right? So in that regard, I just want to mention that there's a difference in training on how you read your new script for the public service and for some stations that are not public service. You know, cannot work in BBC if you don't pass the voice test. I'm not saying that our media are BBC, but I'm saying like that there is.
Well, we have gone quite past where I thought we would wrap up, but I wanted to give the panelists just one last opportunity to either pose a question or make a final comment. I want to thank all of our panelists and all of those who joined us in the audience today. At our high point, we were at about 40 some participants, so that's really, I think, quite impressive. I hope that you found these presentations and conversations to be enlightening and that all of us have a clear understanding of each of these 5 countries' media and political systems, and how the US election gets uniquely molded to reflect each country's domestic and international concerns. I want to thank my colleagues in CREES, the Journalism School and Political Science, for helping to promote this event. And thank you to Eric Havens and John Rinnert for their technical support with the webinar. It's getting quite late in Central Europe, where 2 of our panelists are joining us from. So thank you very much. Have a good night. And I hope we can do something similar in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the
Thank
best.
you.
Thank you.
All.
Thank you.
Thank you.